before we dive into the dark, twisted, and occasionally, what the actual hell side of humanity. Here's a quick note from our imaginary legal team, which consists of a sleep-deprived parent, Google, and a stress ball named Greg. This podcast is for educational and entertainment purposes. Yes. Both. It's just me, researching these cases like your overly invested ex creeping your socials, thoroughly, obsessively, and with just a hint of judgment. The opinions here are entirely my own and do not represent law enforcement, lawyers, doctors, or your cousin Karen who thinks she's a detective because she binged 4 crime docs and made a Pinterest board. Also, everyone is innocent until proven guilty in a court of law, even if the vibes are giving that, yep, they did it. And no, I'm not a licensed psychologist or a doctor, just someone with a brain full of psychology textbooks, way too much coffee, and disturbing level of curiosity. And sometimes, there's a handsome guy who's mostly here for the snacks and the dramatic one-liners. So do your own research. I'm here for insight, empathy, and storytelling. Full disclaimers in the episode description.
Hey guys, if you're new here, welcome to my little corner of chaos. I'm Rachel, and I host Crime Unleashed with frequent appearances from my husband and other brave souls I can rope in along the way. This is what I do at night instead of sleeping, like normal people. So, you bring the snacks, your blanket, and your favorite drink, and I'll open the case file. Let's jump in. He was an old, unassuming man, but beneath that innocent grandpa exterior, he was pure evil. A kind, old man on the outside, but beneath, pure, unfiltered nightmare fuel. This guy made even the most seasoned detectives want to bleach their eyeballs. We're talking letters to the victims and the victims' families to just so disturbing they read like horror movie scripts. Self-inflicted torture that makes you physically cringe. And crimes so vile, they shook the nation to its core. So, buckle up, because we're going all the way back where he was born, how he grew up, when he started, and the grim trail of victims that led to his terrifying legacy. This is Hiding in Plain Sight, the horrific stories of the Grandpa Boogeyman, Albert Fish. Welcome to Crime Unleashed.
Before we start, a content trigger warning. This episode includes graphic descriptions of violence, child abuse, sadism, rape, murder, mental health struggles, and crimes involving vulnerable individuals. Listener discretion is strongly advised. Please take care of yourself.
Albert Fish was born May 19, 1870 in Washington, D.C. to Randall Fish and Ellen Frances Howe. His full name was actually Hamilton Howard Fish. And yes, his name kind of sounds like he secretly collects toenail clippings or something equally unsettling. Hamilton Howard Fish. Anyway, later in life, he actually started going by Albert to avoid teasing because he was teased. Albert was one of his dead siblings, so he wanted that and to escape that nickname, Ham and Eggs, which he actually was given at an orphanage in which he spent much of his childhood. So he eventually did change his name. So we're going to call him Albert, and just because that's what he's known by. But I have to say, he actually went by many names. So as time went on, he actually went by the Gray Man, the Boogeyman, the Werewolf of Wisteria, and actually more than that. But again, we're going to call him Albert. So now, if you want to talk about a childhood shaped by pain and neglect, Albert Fish's years, honestly, his early childhood years are heartbreaking. It's an example that Like so many cases we cover, his story reads like a checklist of childhood trauma, the kind that can twist a person into like the darkest ways. But let me be clear, this is not an excuse for what he did. I look at the reasons behind the violence, how they got there, what shaped them, and when they snapped. So I just want to give you the background because I am always, one, fascinated by the mind, but two, I equally find it so heartbreaking that children like this, I mean, they just do not get to grow up or even have a chance at a life. So his father was 75 years old when he was born. Yeah, 75. His dad was literally old enough to be his great grandfather. But his mother, Ellen, was significantly younger, by 45 years actually. His family was struggling financially, and actually Randall ended up dying of a heart attack when Albert was just 5 years old, leaving Ellen alone with multiple children, no support, and a crumbling mental health. His siblings were Walter, Annie, and Edwin. Albert Fish didn't exactly come from a line of Sunday school teachers and apple pie bakers. His family tree was more like a twisted, gnarled thing rooted deep in mental illness and instability. So, I mean, they had a lot of problems. And as I will speak on this nature versus nurture, which I tend to always do, this case, and you can decide on your own, my opinion, but this case, he's definitely got both going on here for sure. But his uncle battled a full-blown mania. I mean, one of his brothers ended up in a state mental hospital, and a half-brother was tormented by schizophrenia. So, again, so much going on. His sister Annie was diagnosed with what they called a mental affliction, and 3 more relatives were confirmed to suffer from various psychological disorders. Even his own mother wasn't spared, reportedly plagued by both visual and auditory hallucinations. So, no, but Albert was born in chaos, handed down like a cursed family heirloom, wrapped in silence and stigma, though. Because, first of all, please understand, mental illness nor childhood environment does not excuse the tragedy that happened, not even close, but it does make you stop and think. Before Albert Fish ever became the boogeyman, the darkness was already circling around him, waiting. So, again, he was smacked with both. This is where I start thinking about the age-old debate, nature versus nurture. So, what shapes a monster? Is it the blood, the environment, the pain, all the above? But we'll get into that more once we explore his childhood, because trust me, it does matter. And in this case, it may have been the match that lit the fire, really. Now, his mother, unable to cope and not able to afford to take care of him, she left him in an orphanage where he was brutally abused. St. John's Orphanage in Washington, a place that would mark the beginning of his descent into long life trauma. This is why I hate the system, though. Everything about it, even to this day. St. John's Orphanage was a children's home in Washington, D.C. in 1870. It was founded as St. John's Hospital for Children in a house on Pennsylvania Avenue, and it was the principal charity of St. John's Church on Lafayette Square. The orphanage cared for children who were neglected, whose parents had died, or whose parents were unable to care for them. Historical records show that orphanages during this era were often strict and highly structured, but children marched to mills in uniforms, lived by rigid routines, and were frequently subjected to corporal punishment. Food was scarce, and many reported feeling constantly hungry. And not just any kind of abuse happened here. This was truly next level sadistic abuse. Truly and honestly, it is incredibly sad. If you were able to listen to my last episode, this one actually happens to be kind of the same in the whole nature versus nurture. This is another hard one to just determine exactly which one it is, or if it's both. But in my personal opinion, it is absolutely both biological and environmental. But you guys let me know what you think about this because I love to hear, what you guys think. According to an analysis by the American Institute for the Advancement of Forensic Studies, the case of Albert Fish has sparked widespread discussion among professionals studying the roots of paraphilic serial murder, particularly in the context of the classic nature versus nurture debate. His background, as outlined in their report, reflects a disturbing mix of biological vulnerabilities and environmental trauma, often linked to extreme behavioral disorders, which I'm sure you guys know and understand. I just like to throw it out there. The sad and crazy part was that it is said that he didn't just endure the pain that he was, at this orphanage. Instead of growing frightened or withdrawn from the pain, he actually started to enjoy it, is what they say. He says later, "I was there till I was nearly 9, and that's where I got started wrong." This is what Fish would say later. He learned to equate the pain with pleasure, something that would, warp his understanding of relationships, punishment, and the human body for the rest of his life. So this actually included piquerism. So that word is derived from the French word piquer, meaning to prick. It is a sexual interest in penetrating the skin of another person using sharp objects such as pens, razors, or knives, but also yourself. So he is also known as to have it's called paraphilia, which is a sexual disorder characterized by intense sexual arousal from atypical behaviors, objects, or situations. So later in life, Fish would indulge in the act known as this, in which he would shove needles into his body around the area between his scrotum and his anus. But all of this, and the reason why I'm telling you all of this is because the pain, the abuse that they endured in this orphanage was incredibly horrific. And he learned to not only take it, but he learned in his work, he learned to love it. And this is incredibly heartbreaking to live a life, to live like this as a child. Pain became his only escape. When you're a child and suffering is all you know, you don't get the luxury of hating it forever. Now, I can't say that for everyone, but this case is, it's just really unfair to me that this happened to him. And again, I'm not excusing his behavior. I really am not, but it is unfair for a child to have to go through that. The thing is, people say, quote, "he liked it, he even loved it." And I can't just get behind this. Now, this is my opinion, and everyone has their own opinion. The aspect of Fish's early experience is profoundly tragic from a psychological standpoint. When a child is subjected to persistent trauma and pain, especially without the safety or nurture, the brain adapts. Not because the experience is tolerable, but because adaptation becomes necessary for survival. In cases like this, we often see what's referred to as trauma bonding or learned submission, where pain becomes internalized as familiar, sometimes even misinterpreted as affection or attention. And over time, the individual may not consciously recognize the harm because they've framed it around normal. And so it's less psychologically threatening than acknowledging the depth of his suffering or their suffering. So suggesting that he liked it may reflect a misinterpretation rooted in observable behaviors rather than an understanding of the complex trauma responses. It's a convenient label, one that bypasses the difficult questions. What went wrong, who failed him, and what might have changed had someone intervened. It's more comfortable for society to categorize him as a monster, and it simplifies the narrative. But psychological reality is rarely that clean. Because here's the truth. Mental illness, yeah, it can be inherited, but cruelty, that's taught. That's conditioned. And when you grow up being taught that pain is normal, that love looks like violence, it rewires you. Albert didn't grow up in a home. He grew up in an institution built on pain. And when pain is all you know, you stop recognizing it as wrong. You don't even know what love is. And again, not excuse, more like a clue, a glimpse into how monsters are made, not always born. And in Albert Fish's case, that monster was taking shape very early. By the time Albert Fish's mother was able to reclaim custody, the psychological damage had already taken root. The trauma he endured during his formative years had really just formed his development, like ink absorbed into paper, leaving an imprint that could not simply be undone. Children are extraordinarily adaptive, but they are also profoundly vulnerable. Their mind functions like emotional sponges, absorbing not just the content of their experiences, but the meaning behind them. When trauma occurs during early developmental stages, particularly without a protective caregiver or the opportunity for safe processing, it often becomes encoded into this child's sense of identity and worldview, which you will see. This kind of early unbuffered trauma doesn't just fade, it evolves. It mutates. In psychological terms, we might see this as the beginning of distorted attachment or formation of personality pathology, particularly when the child is forced to make sense of overwhelming pain with no emotional framework to contain it. So, and depending on the child's temperament, neurobiology, and the social environment, this kind of trauma can push development in drastically different directions toward internalized outcomes like depression and self-harm, or externalized behaviors such as aggression, disassociation, or in rare cases like Fish, extreme violence and other fixations. Okay, sorry, I went on a tangent, so I'll get back to it. So in 1880 now, his mother has him, but he would just run away every chance that he got. He would also frequently wet his bed, and this lasted until the age of 11. At the same time, he fell out of a cherry tree and he hits his head very hard. So hard, in fact, that he would often have headaches, dizzy spells, and a severe stutter. And I find that very interesting because with everything else that he has going on with him, this is just adding on top of this, and he's a child. This is I feel like this would be so overwhelming to have so many things going on. But 2 years later, Fish formed a relationship with a telegraph boy who introduced him to drinking urine and eating feces. This is also when he began going to public bathrooms to watch boys undress for sexual gratification. By the time he was a teenager, Albert Fish's fractured mind had already crossed several red lines and then set fire to the rest of the warning tape, really. This is also when he changed his name to Albert. Children in his school called him Ham and Eggs, as I mentioned, so he changed it to hopefully prevent them from mockery. And as I mentioned earlier, also Albert was actually the former name of one of his younger brothers that had died, which again, I also find that interesting. To me, in my head, to change your name to that, for me, I feel like it was one smart part of his life that maybe a person that he really cared about. And of course, I don't know. It doesn't say. But I feel like maybe he did. Maybe he cared about this person and that person died and they were gone. So he brought him back. I don't know. But I do find it odd to change your name to your brother that died and not have some kind of emotional attachment to it. So at the same time, around 15, according to documentation highlighted in the AIAFS report, Albert Fish had a long history of psychiatric institutionalization. I'm sure I said that wrong. During which clinicians constantly noted signs of severe personality disturbances, describing him as exhibiting both abnormal and psychopathic traits. He was also identified as religious, using scripture to rationalize his violent and sadistic behavior. Most disturbingly, Fish believed that his actions were actually divinely mandated, claiming that God instructed him to torment and mutilate young boys. He was exhibiting a deeply disturbing blend of sexual masochism and sadism. In the UK, they call it sadism, but whatever, however you want to call it. Often, all of this was directed at himself most of the time. We're not talking about minor self-harm though, or just acting out. This was something darker, ritualistic, and it started to escalate. He graduated from school and started working at a grocery store during, he was just doing what so many lost kids do, and that was just really just trying to survive in a world that he felt didn't care if he was alive or not. So not long after that, he was apprenticed into a painter and decorator, but it wasn't just paint, unfortunately, that he was dabbling in. During this time, it's believed that Fish may have worked as a homosexual prostitute. Now, this was the late 1800s, and being gay or homosexual wasn't just taboo. It was criminalized and demonized. We may never know the full truth of those years or what was consensual versus what was survival, but what we do know is that this part of his adolescence marked another turning point in his psyche, because somewhere along the path, Albert Fish, he began to blend pain with pleasure, violence with desire, and that line, it just kept getting thinner until really it just disappeared completely. I mean, what a life. A teenager lost, spiraling with nowhere to turn except for where he was forced to turn, and then where the only place that he knew, which was pain and just sadistic everything. I'll never excuse what he became. The moment he started hurting others, my empathy turns to the victims, of course, but my heart, it will always break for the little boy he once was, the one that never really had a chance. So Fish began whipping himself regularly, often with a makeshift cat o' nine tails, or the paddles embedded with nails, really is what it is. Later, his children would often witness this as well. Not only that, he would insert needles into his pelvic area and lower abdomen, not just on occasion, but also regular habit. And here's the kicker. Here's the sad thing. He didn't take them out. In fact, in later years, during his incarceration, doctors would x-ray his body. They discovered at least 29 to 30 needles still embedded in his pelvic region. Just imagine living with that. Sitting, walking, sleeping with sharp metal objects stuck inside your body on purpose. This is crazy. Was it punishment, a penance, a way to feel control again? We may never know for sure, but one thing is clear. This wasn't just about pain. It was about control, compulsion, and growing detachment from reality. In 1898, Albert Fish's mother arranged for him to marry Anna Mary Hoffman. She was 9 years younger, which he was 28 at this time, and she was 19 at the time. And they went on to have 6 children: Albert Jr., Anna, Gertrude, Eugene, John, and Henry. And on paper, one big family, a working man, maybe even a little slice of normal. But like so many things with Albert Fish, the surface meant nothing, because underneath things were already boiling. In 1903, Fish had his first real run-in with the law. He was arrested for grand larceny and thrown into Sing Sing prison. That's the name of it. But this is actually the same prison where he would one day die, where his first, big taste of incarceration really came, was Sing Sing prison. When he got out, Fish started responding to classified ads placed by women looking for work or companionship, a popular way of seeking domestic work or pen pals in the early 1900s. But Albert wasn't looking for love or friendship or anything that even resembled normal interaction. He sent graphic, disturbing letters detailing sexual fantasies involving extreme pain, violence, and everything else that is sadistic to many women. Some of these women reported the letters to the police, but back then there just wasn't any there weren't many laws against that sort of thing. At worst, it was also seen as a nuisance, so a perverted prank, but it wasn't a prank. It was a warning sign. And in these letters, he often described acts of cannibalism, bodily mutilation, sexual torture, long before he even committed a documented murder. So he was writing these all down before he committed them. In 1910, Albert's wife left him, and she also left the children for another man. She left the children with Albert. So he actually blamed all his actions on her infidelity. And I can't imagine what the children thought. I will never understand that. I will never understand a parent that can't even think about doing this. You can leave, but take your children. I mean, you know him. He was your husband. You know him. In the same year, Albert Fish crossed paths with his first victim, Thomas Keaton or Kedden. He was a 19-year-old young man with intellectual disabilities. And when I say that, it was actually not confirmed. That it was just most people said that they believed that he had intellectual disabilities. Fish lured him in with promises of work and gained his trust. He always did that. He was able to gain people's trust. Sadly, Keaton thought it was an opportunity, but it turned out to be this unimaginable nightmare. Fish lured him in, tied him up, hung him, and then he committed a brutal act of mutilation. He cut off Keaton's penis, He cut off Keaton's penis. Fish would later say, "I shall never forget his scream or the look he gave me." That's quote from Fish. And something about that quote it stuck with me, because you know what? This was the moment Fish started tasting the power that he would later crave so deeply. And yet, he actually didn't kill Keaton. He wanted to. That was the plan, but he got spooked. The summer heat made him paranoid. He was paranoid that the smell of a decomposing body would give him away. So instead, he poured peroxide on the wound and he wrapped it in a Vaseline-covered handkerchief, and he left a $10 bill by Keaton's side by where he was laying, and he kissed him on the head goodbye. He kissed him. Yeah. Then he hopped on a train home like it was just another day. Fish would later say, quote, "Never heard what become of him or tried to find out." So in other words, he didn't care. Right there, that's the kind of cold, detached evil that should rattle your soul if you think about it. And to this day, no one knows what happened to Thomas Keaton after that. And like it says, he actually vanished from history. I cannot find anything else on Thomas Keaton. And I can't imagine either. If he was a survivor of something so dark, so inhumane, and then just disappear, it is quite bizarre and sad. This disappearance adds a haunting layer to an already tragic story, and I just don't know if I believe Fish didn't kill him. I don't know. But unfortunately, that was also just the beginning of a dark descent. And again, while his traumatic childhood provides important context, it alone cannot fully explain the severity of his crimes. Similarly, I can't. Similarly, oh, fuck me. Similarly, a family history of serious mental illness may have contributed to his psychological profile, but it does not by itself account for the extreme nature of his behavior. So that's how I feel about this whole thing, but I think that is a true statement. Fish was a suspect in apparently at least 10 murders during his lifetime. And although he only confessed to 3 murders, he confessed to 3 murders, but then he actually claimed that he murdered at least 100 people. So let's be real. We may never know the actual number, but they did get him on 3. which is that's insane. I don't know. But he actually began targeting children after that, but he targeted the ones that he thought wouldn't be missed. Often it would be marginalized communities. He would exploit their vulnerability. The exact number of his victims is truly uncertain. But I hate that. Detective William King, the one who chased Fish to the bitter end, believes that he actually killed at least 4 children in New York City alone. But psychiatrist Dr. Frederick Wortham thought it was 5. And police, they estimated the death toll was probably between 8 and 15. But if you ask me, and nobody did, but if you ask me, numbers don't matter when you're talking about this level of evil. Whether it was 1, 5, 50, or 100, every single one of these children, humans, mattered. Every life that he took was a human life, and it was extinguished. And the fact that we may never know all their names, that might be the most heartbreaking part of it all, though. However, we're going to talk about his confirmed victims, the ones we actually do know about, and then we'll talk about the suspected victims. Francis McDonald, 1924. Now, also, just to put in there, throw in there trigger warning. In July of 1924, 9-year-old Francis McDonald disappeared while playing near his Staten Island home. His body was later found hanging from a tree, showing signs of severe beating and strangulation. Now, Fish denied involvement, but a neighbor identified him as the exact man that he had actually chased from his property around the time McDonald's disappearance. Francis's mother, Anna McDonald, later told reporters she had seen a strange man walking through the neighborhood earlier that same day. She described him as a shuffling man, muttering to himself and making odd hand gestures. Quote, everything about him seemed faded and gray, she said. That haunting description would earn the unknown man a nickname that stuck. They called him the Gray Man. The next one was Billy Gaffney, 1927. In February 1927, 4-year-old Billy Gaffney vanished while playing in a Brooklyn apartment, the hallway, with his friend, 3-year-old Billy Beaton. Beaton later described their abductor as the Boogeyman, which he later actually told the police the Boogeyman took him. Fish eventually confessed to these crimes, providing chilling details of the murders and the cannibalism involved. His details were so sickening that even detectives had to leave the room. Then there was Grace Budd. Grace Budd, and this was 1928, and this is the crime that really caught him. And it's probably the most infamous of Fish's crimes, and a lot of people already know about it, but here we go. Grace Budd was a 10-year-old in 1928. Posing as a man named Frank Howard, 58-year-old Fish visited the Budd family under the pretense of offering employment to Grace's older brother. He had answered a classified ad placed by the 18-year-old Edward Budd, Grace's older brother. So Fish presented himself as a humble, kind-hearted farmer, a grandpa. He was just looking to hire a strong young man for light labor on his estate in upstate New York. He met Edward's family, his mother, Delia, his father, Albert Sr., and Edward's 10-year-old sister, Grace Budd. According to reports, Fish was well-dressed, soft-spoken, and full of flattery. He immediately gained the family's trust, especially Delia's, the mother. Then, in a sickening twist, he told the Budds that before Edward came to work, he needed to attend his niece's birthday party, and he asked if Grace could accompany him for the day. The Budds hesitated, but Fish was convincing. After all, he was an old man. He was harmless. He even gave them an address where the party was supposed to take place. Grace put on her white Sunday dress and her hat, and she kissed her parents goodbye, and she was never seen alive again. Sadly, 6 years passed with no word, no evidence, and no body. She was a missing girl and a grieving family. and they were left in agonizing pain. I mean, again, something else that I just cannot imagine. I don't want to imagine, but my heart, just absolutely breaks for them. Then, in November 1934, Delia Budd received a letter in the mail. No return address, no explanation, just pages of handwritten horror. Fish sent an anonymous letter to the Budd family detailing the horrific fate of their daughter. Ugh, and it just makes me so sad. But I'm going to read this letter in a minute. But first, I wanted to go through the suspected victims, the not officially confirmed, and he was not convicted of these victims, but they definitely were his. The first one was Yetta Abramowitz. She was 12. She was strangled and beaten on the roof of a 5-story apartment house on 1013 Simpson Street in the Bronx on May 14th, 1927. She died in a hospital shortly after she was found. An unidentified man matching Fish's physical description was sighted trying to lure several local young girls into dark hallways and alleys on the same date of Yetta's death. I was going to try to say her last name, but I couldn't. I didn't want to mess it up. The next one was Mary Ellen O'Connor, a 16-year-old girl found brutally murdered on February 15, 1932 in a wooded area of Far Rockaway, Queens, New York. Her mutilated body was discovered close to a house Fish had been painting at the time, raising immediate suspicion. And then the other one is Benjamin Collings. He was killed December 15, 1932. Fish was suspected in this, but there was not much information on him. And then the other one, Emma Richardson, October 3rd. She was 5. And again, not much information on her as well. Then we actually do have one survivor that we know of, and it was a young boy. His last name was Quinn, he actually almost fell into Fish's trap. He was 12 in 1931, and Fish befriended him and his friends, offering them food and a place to rest after they were playing outside. But when they entered Fish's apartment, they all noticed something odd. The man had laid out strips of fabric and belts on the bed, and he claimed that they were going to play a game. That was quoted. Suddenly uneasy, him and his friends bolted, and years later he actually would realize just how close he came to death. This incident was corroborated in multiple interviews Fish gave to the detectives, as well as statements by Quinn during the investigation. These kids escaped a nightmare. Now, the one thing that sealed his legacy, Albert's legacy of absolute evil, was this letter. Fish didn't just commit unthinkable crimes, he wanted the world to know. He wrote to her family. He wrote to a lot of people, but he wrote to her family graphically detailing what he had done, like some twisted trophy. So I am going to walk gently into this next part, where I want to handle it with empathy for Grace's, her and her family, and every reader or listener trying to wrap their mind around something so inhumane. So first of all, trigger warning. The letter is graphic, deeply disturbing, and profoundly cruel. And I'm not going to read it word for word out of respect for my audience and Grace's family, but here's a carefully paraphrased and sourced breakdown. Fish begins the letter claiming he once lived in China, where he allegedly developed a taste for human flesh. He describes in grotesque detail how he took Grace to an abandoned house, told her to stay outside while, quote, he got ready, then stripped naked so he wouldn't get blood on his clothes. He admits that he strangled her, cut her into pieces, and cooked parts of her body over the course of 9 days. Then he claims he consumed portions of her, namely her buttocks, with it's stew, so with onions and carrots. But what makes this letter even more chilling is really the tone. It reads like a casual confession. There's absolutely no remorse, no urgency. It is absolutely monstrous, and it's very calm. Investigators later confirmed several of the details in this letter were only something that the killer could have known, so it was undeniably authentic. And if you want to read the full letter, I'm going to add the link in the show notes where you can actually read the full letter. I can't even imagine or even begin to imagine what it was like for her parents getting that letter, reading those words. And honestly, I didn't even read what was in there. Not really. What I read was horrible. But if that had been my child, I swear to you, there wouldn't have been a force on earth strong enough to hold me back. Not police, not courts. There's miles of open country and there's plenty of space. There's plenty of space to make sure that justice was personal, if you know what I mean. I would have never let that go. Evil doesn't seem like it's not a strong enough word for what Fish had become. There are literally no words for the kind of monster that he was made into. Fish made a mistake that unraveled everything. He sent that now infamous letter to Grace Budd's family. And honestly, it's wild to think that something as seemingly minor as the stationery he used would actually be the thing that brought him down, because that is what happened. That one piece of paper actually led investigators to a flop house, then to a landlord, and finally to a name. From there, the trial just lit up like wildfire. And I'm so glad that he slipped up. That careless mistake, and I don't even know if it's a careless mistake. I don't know if he really wanted it to happen, but it is the reason Grace's family got some kind of, I don't know if I can even say justice, but something. They got something back. But the more I think about it, I do wonder, did he want to be found? Because let's face it, Albert Fish wasn't hiding anymore. Not really. He didn't care about red flags or evidence or being discreet. He was writing letters, showing up at family homes. He was leaving behind patterns really that were starting to be very clear that it was practically a roadmap. His second mistake it wasn't just the paper alone, or the stationery paper. It was also Fish returning to that same boarding house after he sent the letter. That allowed investigators to catch him in person once they were tipped off. So Albert Fish told them that he murdered Grace Budd in an abandoned house known as Wisteria Cottage. It was located at 359 Mountain Road in East Irvington, New York on June 3rd, 1928. Neighbors recalled seeing a man matching Fish's description enter that house around the same time of Grace's disappearance. He was arrested on December 13th, 1934. Under questioning, he did not deny a thing. A detective later told the Brooklyn Times-Union that Fish didn't just confess, he relished the details. He described the murder with a calm coldness, like he was recounting a memory instead of a nightmare. Quote, he took Grace to a room one flight up and after a little while told her to go out on the lawn and pick wildflowers. That's what the detective told the newspaper. He also said, quote, a few minutes later he called Grace to come back again. Fish confessed that he seized her and choked her and cut her throat, end quote. After taking her life, Fish dismembered the 10-year-old and buried her body near the home. So this is what he's telling the detectives, so that the detectives were able to locate her skull where he said it was. He wanted people to know. I believe that he wanted to be seen. He didn't want to hide anymore. They say that he literally bragged about it, offering details even the police hadn't known. He was practically gleaming as he recounted his horrific acts in horrifying detail to the detectives, like it was some kind of twisted victory for him. He even smiled while he described his crimes. He was more than proud of what he did. So I do not feel that he was trying to hide it. I feel that he wanted to be remembered or leave his mark on the world in the most twisted way possible. His trial, it was apparently one of the most disturbing in history. Albert Fish's trial for the premeditated murder of 10-year-old Grace Budd commenced on March 11, 1935, in White Plains, New York. Presiding over the case was Judge Frederick P. Close, with Albert F. Gallagher leading the prosecution and James Dempsey, a former Peekskill mayor, heading the defense. His defense, what I'm sure you can guess, was insanity, and obviously no one was arguing that he was insane. From the outset, Fish's defense centered on the insanity plea. Dempsey portrayed Fish as a psychiatric phenomenon, emphasizing his extensive history of sexual abnormalities and claiming that Fish was driven by uncontrollable impulses. The defense introduced testimonies from psychiatrists who detailed Fish's numerous sexual fetishes. The primary expert witness for the defense was Dr. Frederick Wortham, a psychiatrist specializing in child development. Wortham testified about Fish's religious delusions, particularly his fixation on the biblical story of Abraham and Isaac. He explained that Fish believed sacrificing a child would serve as a penance for his sins, and that divine intervention would prevent the act if it were meant to be. Wortham concluded that Fish was insane, operating under distorted perceptions of sin and atonement. The prosecution countered the insanity defense by presenting witnesses who attested to Fish's awareness of his actions. Dr. Menace Gregory, former manager of the Bellevue Hospital, I think that's how you say it, where Fish had been evaluated, testified that while Fish exhibited abnormal behaviors, he was sane and understood the nature of his crimes. Similarly, the Dr. Lichtenstein, a physician at the tomb, stated that Fish's self-inflicted pain was a means to achieve sexual gratification, not evidence of insanity, which is really important because many people will say that that is insane. And technically the action itself is, but that doesn't make him insane. The prosecution emphasized that his meticulous planning and attempts to evade capture demonstrated his comprehension of right and wrong, further undermining the insanity plea. The trial was marked by harrowing episodes that really truly left an impact on all that was present. On the third day, over strenuous objections from the defense, the prosecution introduced a box containing Grace Budd's remains as evidence. Detective William F. King recounted Fish's confession in chilling detail. This is where he displayed all of Grace's, stuff in the box, that small skull, to the courtroom. The moment really truly underscored the brutality of Fish's actions and left many in the courtroom visibly shaken. The jury, they did not care. They declared him sane and guilty. And after 10 days of testimony and deliberation, the jury faced a profound dilemma. While many acknowledged Fish's mental disturbances and mental state, they ultimately deemed him legally sane and responsible for his actions. His sentence? The electric chair. He was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to death by electrocution. So, although he was sentenced to the electric chair, it's hard to say that justice was really truly served. I think that we all know there is never justice for crimes like this. On January 16, 1936, Albert Fish was strapped into the electric chair at Sing Sing Prison, just like so many others before him. But Fish wasn't like anyone else. Years of self-inflicted pain had left his body riddled with sewing needles, and at least 29 to 30, as we had mentioned, they were still lodged deep in his pelvis area, visible in the x-rays taken after his arrest. Some say those needles interfered with the electric current, and that it took more than one jolt to finally end his life. But whether that part is fact or legend, one thing is certain. The monster known as Whether that part is fact or legend, one thing is certain. The monster known as the Gray Man and many other names met his end in a chair built for justice. Albert Fish truly was evil in its purest form. a predator who preyed on innocence, who took pleasure in suffering, and who left a legacy of nightmares that still haunt true crime history to this day, haunted forever by the loss, the cruelty, and the vile confessions he had really the nerve to write down for those poor families. I just, again, cannot imagine. In the end, Fish didn't beg. He didn't cry. And when asked if he had any final words, he reportedly said, quote, "I don't even know why I'm here." A chilling note in Fish's, what they reported in his diary, in his private diary. Though it is not found in any court or police record, it is quoted to say, quote, "When I was young, I daydreamed a lot. In these daydreams, I would lie on my back in a giant meadow with my eyes closed. There was nobody on the planet but me. I could hear birds in the trees, maybe the sound of a train or an airplane in the distance, and I felt a happiness, a peace I have never once felt in this real world." That is incredibly sad, and I do not know when this was, what age he was, but it is very sad. But remember, guys, the boogeyman was real, and his name was Albert Fish. I'm just kidding, but I'm not, kind of. Either way, all the signs that he had been piling up, and thank the Lord for a freaking stationary slip-up to get him behind bars. It is absolutely crazy. Okay, guys, thoughts and questions. Well, just one question, and it's the whole nature versus nurture. What made Albert Fish into the man he became? Was it something already living inside him, something genetic, twisted in the womb, passed down through generations of instability, or was it the environment? The beatings, the shame, the whole time that he was just completely alone in his own thoughts, the emotional starvation that he endured when he needed love the most? I feel that it is both. And it's not rare for it to be both nature and nurture, but I do want to hear what you guys feel. Do you believe in nature versus nurture? I mean, we just went through his entire life, and it's clear there were a million red flags along the way, but it's also pretty clear his childhood set him up for this. But does that mean this kind of darkness was inevitable, or could something have stopped it? Let me know in the comments. We will be back next week with another dark chapter. Please come by, say hi. Love to hear from you. Bye.